Welcome, everybody. My name is Heather Fenyas. I'm a national board member of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA. I'd like to begin with an exceptional thank you to the minister who I think has been sprinting between Zoom screens, and we are so appreciative. I apologize for the delay, but as she said, this is the way democracy works. And unfortunately, as a result, we have lost our ASL interpreter, but we have closed captioning at the bottom that I hope will help everybody. On behalf of the entire CIJA Board of Directors, welcome to our inclusion event, Mobilizing Canadians for Inclusion, with the Honourable Carla Qualtro, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion. As the advocacy agent of Jewish federations across Canada, CIJA represents hundreds of thousands of Jewish Canadians. It's a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting Jewish life in Canada through advocacy. CIJA is committed to supporting all members of the Jewish disability community by advocating for issues of greatest concern to them in improving the quality of their lives. This year, for the Jewish Disability Month, JDAM, CIJA has joined with Jewish Federations of North America to bring you a broad range of online resources, programs, and events. All of the JDAM events are fully accessible, and we would like to thank Toyota for providing a very generous grant to make this happen. We are so pleased to be joined by so many Canadians for this very important event with the Honourable Carla Qualtro, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion. Minister Qualtro was first elected as Member of Parliament for Delta in 2015. A successful lawyer, dedicated volunteer, and Paralympic swimmer, Minister Qualtro has always demonstrated a strong commitment to equity and inclusion, addressing inequity and championing diversity. She has practiced human rights law at the federal and provincial levels. She chaired the Minister's Council on Employment and Accessibility in British Columbia and was an adjudicator of the Workmen Compensation Appeals Tribunal. Passionate about the power of sport and physical activity to change lives, Minister Qualtro has volunteered locally, nationally, and internationally, including with the International Paralympic Committee and for the Toronto 2015 Pan and Parapan American Games. Minister Qualtro has been visibly impaired since birth. And as an athlete, she won 3 Paralympic and 4 World Champion medals. The minister is past president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, past chair of the Sports Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada, past board member of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and past vice chair of the Delta Gymnastics Society. The recipient of many awards, Minister Qualtro has been recognized as one of Canada's most influential women in sport numerous times. And in 2012, she was a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. At the heart of all of this hard-earned and noteworthy accomplishments is commitment to diversity, equity, and of course, inclusion. And personally, speaking with my good friend, Judge David Arnott, the Chief Commissioner of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, from my home here in Saskatoon, he offers strong praise for Minister Qualtro. He assures me that her commitment to the rights of all Canadians is unassailable, that she has taken on as her responsibility, giving Canadians with disabilities their deserved and fair place in our society. Her respect for our democracy and the principles of good citizenship is self-evident and paramount. Minister Qualtro, I will now turn things over to you and invite you to share some opening remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you. I get very frazzled when people read my bio, so I apologize. And what a wonderful, wow, thank you. I'm just going to drive ahead so that my frazzledness can go down a little bit. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Je suis heureuse de me joindre à vous virtuellement à partir du territoire traditionnel des Premières Nations de Troisième et de Musqueam. And thank you for your kind words of introductions. And thank you as well for inviting me to speak as part of Jewish Disability Awareness Month. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I'm excited to talk about what we are doing and our plan to make communities more inclusive. You know as well as I do that COVID-19 has taken its toll. The world has been upended, and so have our day-to-day lives. Persons with disabilities have been disproportionately impacted, whether that's because of underlying medical conditions that put them at greater risk, discrimination in accessing information and healthcare, or the additional challenges that come with our public health measures, such as masks and physical distancing. From the onset, our federal government intentionally took a disability inclusive approach in our pandemic response. We immediately created what we called our COVID-19 Disability Advisory Group, which was comprised of national leaders in disability rights and inclusion to provide real-time, on-the-ground advice on the lived pandemic experience. This group provided input into policy and economic response, and fundamentally forever changed the way Canada responds to a crisis. I can't tell you how true that last part is. We have changed forever the way a government will respond because of this. We really knew how our broad response measures would impact Canadians with a disability. We identified systemic gaps and challenges, and we filled in those gaps and challenges. We focused on specific population and tailored our response to meet the specific needs of Canadians with disabilities. Nous avons pris des mesures ciblées pour les personnes en situation de handicap, y compris un paiement unique visant à couvrir les dépenses exceptionnelles qui sont faites. Nous avons également investi dans un nouvel volet national pour l'accessibilité en milieu de travail dans le cadre du Fonds d'intégration pour les personnes handicapées, de même que dans notre programme de développement de la technologie accessible. So what's next? Building upon the work of our Disability Advisory Group and of course of the Accessible Canada Act, we committed last fall to creating what we're calling a Disability Inclusion Action Plan, with a strong emphasis on the word action. This plan will be about the concrete measures we put in place and the concrete investments we will make. It will include new direct income support for Canadians with disabilities, a strong employment strategy, and a better process to determine eligibility for government disability programs and benefits based on a modern, inclusive, and dignified understanding of disability. The commitment, obviously, to a Canada Disability benefit has generated a lot of buzz within the disability community, and rightfully so. Modeled after the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors, this benefit will provide direct income support to citizens with working age Canadians with disabilities, and this will have a significant impact on poverty levels, on independence, on choice, and on the quality of life for so many Canadians. And I'm very excited, but there's a lot of work to do on this. With respect to the employment strategy, we're going to focus on both workers and employers. We're going to look to support individuals looking to enter the workforce, individuals looking to return to work post-injury and illness, and individuals looking to advance in their current jobs. We're also going to support entrepreneurs with disabilities, make investments in skills and training, and really champion the business case for disability inclusion. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic is a crisis for sure, but it's also created such an opportunity. In Canada, we've truncated the well-known mantra of nothing about us without us to nothing without us, because everything is about us. Thank you for your work in gathering so many partners together to discuss disability inclusion policy through today and the entire month. You are really embodying this mantra. Des organisations comme le vôtre et ceux de vos partenaires jouent un rôle essentiel dans l'inclusion des personnes en situation de handicap. J'ai vraiment hâte d'avoir de vos nouvelles. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. Let's talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Qualtro, for that brief overview of your government's plans to continue to advocate for the disability community across Canada. So now we're going to move into a moderated discussion with help from our Federation partners in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. and we've put together a panel of community members and agencies to ask you a few questions. So first, I'd like to call on Rivka Augenfeld, a consultant and trainer in Montreal in the field of immigration and refugee policy, programs and procedures, resettlement and integration, intercultural relations, and human rights. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. And it's not often that, at least in my experience, that one gets to talk about immigration issues to a minister from another department. To jump in 2018, IRCC, that's Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, announced some very welcome changes to the regulations regarding the evaluation of excessive demand on health and social services when assessing immigration applications. And the threshold for potential inadmissibility was raised significantly with a commitment for a yearly adjustment. We note, however, that the cost thresholds for 2021 have not yet been announced. Is your department being consulted on this matter to ensure that there is a fair assessment for persons with disabilities? Since past experience has shown us that for some people, their real potential cost to the system is lower than what is projected. And also, will your department offer its expertise to IRCC to ensure that the immigration applicant or the member of their family in question is also being assessed for their real potential contribution to Canada?
Wow, really important question. And, you know, I think we made what I consider to be really fundamental changes to the policy on excessive demand in 2018. But to your point, there's always more we can do. So we did it with a view to better aligning the policy with, you know, modern Canadian values, modern understanding of the contribution of persons with disabilities, because we really felt it was, you know, I certainly felt that it was rooted in this really medical model that kind of discriminated against individuals by not looking at individual circumstances. And I've kept an eye on this, to tell you the truth, since 2018. And I know that while this change was welcomed, I'd say, and clearly long overdue, like you've said, there's more we can do. And now listen, I can tell you, I can assure you, yes, that IRCC works very closely with our Office of Disability Issues at ESDC, which is my department. And that's actually fundamentally changed as well. That wasn't always the case across governments. I think we've improved a lot in the past 5 years, but there's always more we can do. And it goes against the more siloed kind of knee-jerk reaction that has been embedded in our bureaucracies for a long time. But we're really working hard to ensure not only a disability inclusion lens, but an individual approach, like you said, to kind of, you know, we've raised the annual cost threshold for sure. And I know that that's based on information, I think it's by the Canadian Institute for Health Information in their annual report. And this is supposed to be objective, kind of science-based. And I know we had some economists look at it in 2018. And they found, if I recall, that it really was a fair representation. But I think we could do better. And I've poked the Minister of Immigration on this. I think we need to move to more an individual assessment process. That's harder than you think, but I think it will be really helped by what we're doing and what I hope to share with you, what we're doing around conceiving the way we approach disability across government programs for eligibility. And this is going to be one of the programs that benefits significantly from that work. So I'm hopeful. We're not there yet. It was a good start and sent the right message, but there's more work to be done. And just in terms of when, I know that IRCC is in the process of updating the cost threshold for 2021, but I don't think they've published it yet.
No, but thank you so much for that very thorough answer. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for asking. It's an important policy.
Thank you. So next I'd like to invite Liv Mendelson, Director of Accessibility and Inclusion at the Miles Nadell Jewish Community Center in Toronto, to ask our next question.
Hi, Minister Qualtro. It's lovely to be with you again. And our Youth Accessibility Advisory Committee and 40 of the youth who we support have joined on this call and are very excited to be with you as well. And one of the questions that they were really eager to hear addressed is the following. The Accessible Canada Act is our first national accessibility legislation, and there is a lot of excitement about this new chapter for Canada and where we are going in the future. What are the next steps to make Canada more accessible, and what kind of timelines can we expect?
Good question. And another one of my favorite topics, obviously, the Accessible Canada Act. It really fundamentally changed the conversation around disability in Canada. We moved from a really kind of reactive system where individuals had to file complaints within the human rights system to a proactive system where the responsibility and accountability resided in the system itself. So it no longer, we don't, I was a human rights lawyer, and it was so frustrating for people. We had to kind of wait until somebody was discriminated against, denied a job, denied a service, denied housing. And then this entire system would kick in, and 2 years later, someone would conclude, rightfully so, that you shouldn't have been denied that housing or that job. And it was really burdensome and costly for individuals. And the ACA flips that model on its head by creating a system where we create standards that the government has to, hold people to account for. And it will be a systemic response to discrimination. And really, ideally, we'll see that in the years to come reflected in smaller, hopefully, numbers of complaints to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And I'll give you a good example. So, historically, if someone who is blind or visually impaired like myself couldn't access an ATM, we would have to file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission against that one branch of that one bank about that one ATM. And even if we had a successful result and it was concluded that that ATM wasn't accessible, other people would have to go and do that for every other branch and every other bank for every other ATM. In this new system, we're going to have standards for ATMs. So ATMs across the country will have to comply with a kind of a broad accessibility standard, and it won't be on individuals to fight that fight. What we're doing now, though, for me, is to putting the Accessible Canada Act into practice. So we're creating the foundation for accessibility and inclusion, whether it means that we are overhauling our disability policy at the federal government level to working with the Accessible Standards Canada, which is now which was CASDO, pardon me. And we're developing the first set of regulations under the Act to establish, I think we're doing accessibility plans, feedback processes, progress reports, really digging in federal jurisdiction about how organizations, private businesses, government will have to be accessible in the way they behave, the way they interact with citizens, and the way they plan. And they're going to have to show us those plans. We've developed what we call our accessibility data and measurement strategy, which is what we're using to track progress on achieving the objectives of the Act. But in thinking about what I could share with you to really personalize it, I came up with 2 examples that I'll share. So a friend of mine is taking a plain language certificate course at Simon Fraser University here in BC. And he was recently in a class discussion where the prof asked how they could convince an employer to use plain language in their communication. And one of the other students just replied, as a matter of course, tell them it's now the law under the Accessible Canada Act. And he kind of called me up and said, this is what we're doing, right? I mean, it's now random people are referring to the Accessible Canada Act as the thing they're going to wave in the face of an employer to try and make their business more accessible for everyone. And secondly, and I think you'll probably have noticed this, the federal government as well as the provinces are now providing ASL and LSQ interpretation at government briefings. And this has just happened since COVID. We didn't do this before. And I actually would have told you 5 years ago that there's no way we could pull this off. We could never get, this has been happening in the US for 30 years. We could never have convinced all governments to do this. And all of a sudden, with the ACA recognizing ASL, LSQ, and Indigenous Sign Language as the first language of Canadians who are deaf, it was really easy to make it happen. And it will be a legacy of the pandemic that you just won't not see this anymore. It's just going to be the way governments do business. And it just allows so many more people to be included and be able to understand what governments are doing. It's really cool. I don't even know if I answered your question. I'm sorry.
I think that's great. Thank you. It's an exciting time, and a lot of young people are very excited to be part of it.
Well, tell them, be careful. I'm going to come looking for them.
Thank you. That's personally of great interest to me too, because I know here in Saskatchewan, our provincial government is committed to creating an Accessibility Act. And in my work with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, that's been a big area of learning and opportunity and conversation. So thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Mara Schnee, the founding member and chair of the Vancouver Jewish Family Services Client Advisory Committee and a member of the Vancouver Jewish Federation's Planning Council, for our next question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Minister Qualtro. Thank you so much for your time at this meeting. The disability tax credit should be reformed to ensure it is more inclusive, particularly for the poorest disabled Canadians and those with non-physical and/or episodic disabilities that make gaining employment difficult or impossible. What are some of the ways that you and your team are making the application process simpler, less subjective, and more accessible? And also, have you considered making the DTC a refundable tax credit, which would put money into the pockets of the poorest disabled Canadians whose incomes are too low to pay any income tax and benefit from the DTC as it is now? And lastly, just to follow up on the new disability benefit, which many people are excited about, are there any timelines that you can share with us? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's like you're hitting on my top 5 here with all these questions. I mean, the DTC for so long has been in desperate need of reform, and I would even say just overhauling. And it's been really a personal mission of mine in this job over the years to poke that and see what we can do. And I think we've actually cracked the code with our Disability Inclusion Action Plan. So, you know, really what we've seen, and you've clearly seen it as well, is that over the years, this tax credit has evolved. Initially it was meant to be a tax credit to recognize the invisible, the extra cost of disability. And the thinking is that people who face these additional costs had less income to use toward these expenses. And that was what the purpose was of the DTC. And, you know, but in reality, as you highlighted, this is, you know, a non-refundable tax credit, meaning that the poorest and lowest income Canadians with disabilities haven't benefited from it. In fact, many don't even bother to apply because it's such a cumbersome and expensive process, and they're not actually getting any benefit from it at the end of the day. And then what I would say what's happened over the years is the DTC has really evolved to perform a gatekeeping function for the purposes of many other federal and provincial disability supports. And the gap between the purpose of this tax credit and the reality of what it's doing has just been exacerbated. And I'll give you a really good example. The Canadian child benefit, which is for families, it's amount you get every month per child, depending on your level of income. There's a disability component, so you get a little bit extra. The way you get that extra is if your child qualifies for the DTC. So when your child is born, your infant is recognized as having a disability, you actually have to apply for the DTC on behalf of your child to get access to this Canada Child Benefit disability component, which is just crazy in terms of process and the burden we're putting on families to get a tax credit for their newborn in order to get this added support. So we are looking to completely change that. We started in 2018 when the CRA established a Disability Advisory Committee, and they've made some really important recommendations in their first report to us. And we've definitely made some improvements, plainer language guidance, establishing a designated call line for DTT inquiries, digital forms, but that's actually not the work that needs to be done. What we need to do is decouple disability policy from tax policy so that more Canadians can benefit from programs and services. So as I said, I think we've cracked the code. I think we're going to be able to do this through our work on the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, because we're going to come up with a better process to determine eligibility for government disability programs. So we're going to take that out of the DTC. So we're not going to make a tax credit the determining factor for eligibility as like federal government and indeed some provincial government programs. We're going to look at DTC and its criteria. It means, developing criteria that are more consistent with a modern understanding of disability and functional limitations. You mentioned episodic disabilities. That's exactly what we're trying to include. We did a fantastic job in our definition of disability in the Accessible Canada Act. It's consistent with the UN Convention's definition of disability, and that's going to be the baseline. And, I think at the end of the day, what I like to see is your disability and eligibility is assessed in a fair, modern, dignified process. And then because of that, you can claim the DTC or whatever we should replace the DTC with, because I actually agree that we need to look at making it refundable, but not make the DTC the starting point. So, we're really trying to improve the financial security and therefore kind of the independence of Canadians with disabilities. And we can't do that in our current system. And so I'm going to change it. So there you go.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
This is so lovely not to be talking about employment and employment insurance and COVID. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Lisa Romales, an active community member from Vancouver, focusing in the educational space within Jewish community schools and Jewish camps, for our next question.
Hello, Minister Qualtro. Many community members and beyond continue to struggle to meet some of their basic needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Would you and your government evaluate changing the Canada Caregiver credit to make it a refundable tax credit, ensuring that all Canadians caring for relatives with a physical or mental impairment are treated equally?
The simple answer is we have to, right? Because, like other tax credit, the purpose of this was to ensure fairness in the tax system and to recognize the additional expenses related to caregiving. But again, as a non-taxable credit, low-income Canadians benefit the least. And so as we look across our entire federal government kind of suite of initiatives for people with disabilities, for those who carers, as they're called in Australia. In Australia, they actually have what's called a carer benefit, which is a monthly stipend paid to carers, people who either can't work full-time because they're caring for someone or can't work at all because of care responsibilities. So I personally think what you'll see come out of this kind of overhaul of disability policy and programming is an approach where caregiving takes its rightful place in terms of recognizing, the value of it. Certainly COVID happening with this at the same time is super helpful because it's raised the collective kind of mainstream understanding of what we put our caregivers through. But absolutely, it will definitely be part of the kind of the broader look at what we need to do to, I keep going back to the word dignity, to dignify and recognize the kind of role of carers and caregiving in our society and the importance of that work and how much of it is disproportionately borne by women, I should say as an aside, and really dig in on this policy and this tax credit as part of that process for sure. In fact, I've had this conversation with both the Minister of Health and the Minister of Seniors, just making sure that all these perspectives are taken into account.
Thank you. It certainly sounds like things are going in the right direction.
I hope so.
Gary, I know you expect to be, we're good. Okay. We've temporarily lost one of our questions, so we're switching around here. Next, I'd like to invite Gary Gladstone, and Gary is the lead stakeholder relations at RENA. Gary.
Minister Qualtro, what a delight and pleasure to see you again. So sorry it's not in person. and keep up
Yeah.
the great work that you're doing, no question. On behalf of the 1,000 individuals with developmental, intellectual, and diverse abilities served by RENA, and the 160,000 people across the country with intellectual and developmental disabilities, my question is about the absence of research on adults with developmental disabilities. This pandemic has highlighted this much further. Data from the 2012 Canadian Survey on Disability revealed that about 3.8 million adult Canadians reported having a disability, and about 1% were identified as having an intellectual or developmental disability. The Government of Canada has recognized that those with developmental disabilities are vulnerable, at risk, and require special supports through the National Housing Strategy, which I can't thank this government for enough, and the National Dementia Strategy. Could you please advise on what research has been done or is in process with respect to those with intellectual and or developmental disabilities, and how to increase that research?
Well, thanks, and nice to see you again. I didn't put the face together, so I'm glad you reminded me. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have a real struggle with is historic data on persons with disability in kind of meaningful data that we can desegregate and then make really good policy and funding choices based on that. Now, we used to have a survey, PALS, if you'll remember that was discontinued, but we do now have the Canadian Survey on Disability, which we have the 2012 results that you highlighted, but we also have a 2017 data set, which is giving us some comparative data on, it's really a rich data set that we can mine, and we've given it to academics. We've got some concrete data on, development and intellectual disabilities. And, as you said, we know that individuals with developmental disabilities have lower levels of educational attainment than those without disabilities. In fact, if I remember, this is the largest gap than any other disability type. Employment rate is at 22.3%, which is less than a third of the non-disabled community. And this is the kind of information that we use when we look at developing an employment strategy, for example, when we look at our disability inclusion action plan, and what we looked at in developing the National Housing Strategy and the dementia strategies that you mentioned. What I can tell you is, again, the National Housing Strategy, the dementia strategy, were really intentionally inclusive. We sitting around the cabinet table as the first ever minister responsible for persons with disabilities, when these plans come up, if I haven't caught it or they haven't talked before, my job for the past 5 years had been to make sure that the needs and perspectives of the disability community were embedded from the start in these plans. And I can tell you the National Housing Strategy didn't need any prodding or probing or guilting in order to make sure, the CMHC was all over this. They were very inclusive in their development of the NHS. And they're really walking the talk. Not only have they made persons with the disabilities, of course, who we know are precariously housed for the most part, a priority under the NHS, but they also actually have targets for new affordable units for Canadians with disabilities. And that's a really powerful policy tool. Same as in the dementia strategy, intersectionality is really emphasized, and we really understand that people with developmental disabilities are at a higher risk of developing dementia. And so we need to make sure that we consider this from the beginning. What I'd say is we need to do more in data collection. We are working with national disability organizations to try and kind of cull the information that is out there. We're funding different research to get that information, but it's really hard. And again, going back to the previous question, one of the things we don't have at the federal level is a bucket of people with disabilities. I don't know how better to say that. I should probably come up with a better word, but I can tell you, for example, all Canadians who are over age 65, and I can give those people support and directed services, and we can do that for families. But we can't do that right now for working age Canadians because we don't actually have a way to identify, support, directly interact with citizens. And the DCC is pretty much what we have now to do that. It was really frustrating for me when we tried to support do a one-time payment to people with disabilities during last year during COVID. And because that isn't everybody, because not everybody claims the DTC. But one thing I'd really like to see, and one thing we're working towards, is having a way to identify more people more inclusively and directly provide support. And the only way we can do that is by knowing where people are, and for people to confidently be able to identify themselves to us, because they know that that will mean they are better supported and that they are seen and heard by government. Thank you, Minister, for the question.
Thank you very much. And as always, you know, we're here to help you, help us. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Minister, I know it's 5:30 in some places, 4:30 in others. Are you?
I have a little more time. I'm good for another 15 minutes.
Well, we have one more question.
Okay, let's do it.
Awesome. I'd like to invite Harriet Sugar Miller. She's the co-founder and head of a Link Foundation, a new nonprofit in Montreal that supports young adults with neurodiverse challenges and their families by creating alliances for inclusion. And she is here with our next question.
Hi, thank you for this, Minister Qualtro. As you may know, we have a very strong organization of Jewish communities throughout Canada, both locally and provincially, as well as nationally. And we're wondering what our communities can do to make Canadian institutions that all people with disabilities face on a daily basis. What are your thoughts on that?
Were you able to hear it?
I was. I think it's what can you guys do to help make, support what we're doing and make communities more aware. I think that's kind of the gist of it, but there's lots you can do. And I really appreciate the ask, because I really believe fundamentally that we all have a role to play in the kind of reducing barriers side of things and the raising awareness of the benefit of disability inclusion. We've tried to set up more than just a law. We've tried to put in place a culture shift where we go beyond the idea of, oh gosh, I don't even know how to say it politely, this kind of charity model, I guess I would say politely, to understanding the rights of full citizenships that everybody in this country has, and the role that we all have to play and the things that we all have to contribute, and that we should want to celebrate the contributions that everybody can make. So it's really a culture shift within Canadian society that I think we've begun over the past 5 years, putting in place laws, shifting the conversation. This idea that our people are broken and somehow we have to fix them, when I would say that our people are just fine and our systems and our processes are broken and aren't inclusive. And just talking about disability inclusion in a way that promotes the inclusion from the beginning. There's a long-term game here. There's a way to talk about disability, moving away from considering the needs of persons with disabilities being a matter of afterthought or accommodation. And I'd love to have this conversation with David in Saskatchewan, because we lean real heavily and we're pretty darn comfortable in this country on accommodation. And this idea that we're going to build something, draft something, create something that we know doesn't take the needs of everybody into account, but don't worry, eventually we're going to get to accommodating you and you're going to be fine. Instead of saying we're going to build something inclusively from the start. So, as you create your programs, as you deliver services, talk within your networks and with your partners, really challenge people and organizations to be disability inclusive from the beginning and not lean on accommodating or an afterthought or, this is really hard, we'll figure this part out later, let's just see if we can get something off the ground. That leaves people out. The other specific opportunity, of course, is National Accessibility Week. which takes place the very end of May. And where this is the week that we celebrate what communities are doing to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, their families. And I really love the opportunity to work with all of you to really kind of ramp up that week this year and really celebrate the good work that's being done in communities across this country to be more inclusive. And particularly with your young people who sometimes make me feel old because their language is so more evolved and so much more sophisticated around inclusion. I come from a generation of human rights lawyers that talk about the duty to accommodate, not the duty to include. And I love it when there's just an assumption made by young people that of course we have to include. That certainly wasn't the case 30 years ago when I became a lawyer. And I would love to kind of get your youth group involved, and maybe we can do like a splashy event or kind of a youth conference. Maybe I can get the Prime Minister out to talk to young people. I just think it would be really fun to celebrate with young people how far we've come. You know, if you have contacts in employment, you know, challenge employers to be disability inclusive, to recognize the creativity, the innovation, the bold outside of the box thinking that basically comes as a matter of course with someone with a disability, because we all were born into a world that wasn't made for us. So you're not going to get a more innovative, creative employee than someone who has spent their whole life innovating and being creative. So lots of ways we can work together. I'm totally jazzed up at all these thoughts. So thank you very much. And please, let's just stay in contact, because I think there's a lot we can do together.
Thanks, Minister. First of all, David is in the audience, and I can assure you that I'm going to be sure that we facilitate that conversation. And I think it's fair to say we all feel very inspired and hopeful by what you are bringing to this role. It's really quite remarkable. And it's a great opportunity to hear about the great work that our community is engaged in on this accessibility file. We look forward to continuing to work with you and your government to ensure that Canada remains accessible to everybody. And thank you to all our Federation partners and community members who took time out of your day to be part of this important discussion. Thank you, Minister, for sprinting from one Zoom to the other. And I'd like to encourage everybody watching to visit www.jewishtogether.org/JDAM, JDAM, to see more JDAM programming, or please visit CIJA.ca to find out more information on how you can work with us further on this file. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.